Back live tonight on In Focus. The South African Human Rights Commission says Stellenbosch University has violated the rights of Afrikaans-speaking students. These findings are documented in a report released yesterday. The investigation came after the DA and the FF Plus filed a complaint with the Commission on March 2021. For more on this, we're joined now by Matthew du Plessis, the acting South African Human Rights Commission Western Cape manager. Matthew, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Talk to us what where you were investigating first before we get to some of your key findings. What was the initial complaint about?
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. Well, the initial complaint was actually a number of complaints. We received more than one, and the general issue raised was that students in residences at certain Stellenbosch residences in the 2021 welcoming year were either told not to speak Afrikaans or they were told expressly to speak English. So one way or another there seemed to have been some form of language control happening during the welcome period at these residences, and the complaints against us pointed this out. Some focused more on it being a ban on Afrikaans, others focused more on it being a promotion of exclusively English, but the end product ended up being pretty much the same. Those were the complaints. We received one from the VF Plus, who was our first complainant, and then another from Dr. Leon Schreiber from the DA in his capacity as a Member of Parliament. And through them, they brought numerous complaints from affected individuals. And that's what we investigated.
Yeah. And how did you approach the question of multilingualism and inclusiveness for all students when it comes to this question of the language policy?
Well, the Commission recognizes the importance of multilingualism and inclusion, and the only requirement to those things and to anything is the requirement of constitutionality, and that rights are not unfairly limited. So just because something is multilingual and inclusive doesn't necessarily mean that it's constitutional, and that was pretty much the gist of this report. And what we wanted people to understand with this report was that, good intentions aside, if you implement policies incorrectly, they often end up doing more harm than good. And I think that was the finding here.
Yeah. So you're saying compliance with the Stellenbosch University language policy of 2021 would have had unreasonable, impracticable, and absurd and disturbing outcomes. Just expand on that a little bit. What are those outcomes that you have found?
All right. Well, let me clarify. In the report, we're referring to the 2016 language policy, because that was what was in force at the time of the allegations. But also, the report wasn't necessarily about the language policy itself. The policy itself had already been disputed before, all the way up to the Constitutional Court. The investigation here was much rather, how did this policy, if it was the language policy at all, manifest in these residences? And when we say that it resulted in impractical and unreasonable results, we found that through our investigation because of the exclusion that it caused, the violations to the right to freedom of expression and equality and dignity. And those are, in the view of the Commission, completely impractical results, and a policy that ends in those results should probably not have been implemented in the first place.
Right. And what then do you recommend as remedy for the university?
All right, so we made one recommendation, and the other was a proposed remedial action, or a number of remedial actions. So the proposed remedial actions were, number one, that the respondent issue a written public apology, and that the apology must make clear that the respondent recognizes that the Stellenbosch University, is responsible for the conduct and policies of its residences and the human rights violations found by the Commission to have been perpetrated in the report, and that they undertake to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We furthermore propose that the respondent should, within 14 days, write to all residence leadership, making this clear, directing them expressly not to implement English-only or similar language policies. And then the respondent should also, within 60 days, provide training of residence leadership in respect of the correct interpretation and application of the language policy, which is currently the 2021 policy, but the needs are the same. And then insofar as recommendations go, we recommended that Stellenbosch University consider rephrasing section 7.2.5 of the 2021 language policy, which currently states that in student communities, language is used in such a way that ensures that where reasonably practicable, everyone is included and able to participate. The Commission recommended that the condition was added to state the following: and provided that the fundamental human rights of those affected are not unreasonably and justifiably limited.
Yeah.
That was our last recommendation there.
So give us, while we are there, practical example of that inclusion. You're saying their rights are not being violated. In what way would you say?
All right. Well, then I guess we need to speak to the findings in the report. Because when we speak about not wanting rights to be unreasonably and justifiably limited, and unjustifiably limited by policies like this, we're speaking of the findings that we made here. And those findings are, well, the report is complicated, and I think it deals with complicated and sensitive topics. But by telling a person what language to speak, you infringe a number of their rights. It's important for the country to understand this. It's one of the things I hope the report clarifies, and I'm sure that the Commission thinks it does, is that if you do this, first of all, it violates, very importantly, the right to freedom of expression. This is not something that was actually picked up on by the parties at the beginning. The complainants didn't mention freedom of expression because it's actually not something that has come up. But it is actually true. The language in which one expresses themselves is related to their freedom of expression. So if you want to say something, and you want to say it in your mother tongue or any other language that you're comfortable with, but then you're told, no, you have to say it in this language, that actually does violate your freedom of expression, because language is more than just a tool to convey facts and opinions. It's deeply linked to your emotions, your dignity, your self-worth, and to the way you wish to express yourself. The policy as well is any policy where you would have to tell a person what language to speak also violates the rights to language and culture. You do have the right to speak the language of your choice, as well as the right to equality, to not be discriminated against on the basis of language. The reason we say that is that English speakers in this context were given preferential treatment to those who didn't speak English. Because if your home language was not English, you were offered a less favorable alternative to those who could speak English. You were told to speak a language that was not your mother tongue. And in that example, we find discrimination. And then lastly, human dignity, because violations to human dignity very easily arise out of violations to equality. And also freedom of expression. There was a finding in the report that the language you choose to speak also encases your dignity and your person as you speak it. So those are the kinds of violations we found occurred here, and those are the kinds of violations we, in our recommendation, are warning against.
Yes. So how does that, I mean, I suppose this rises from the question of what language would be spoken at residencies. But for example, in a lecture room and one wants to express themselves in Xhosa, but the professor in the room is Afrikaans. How do you marry that particular recommendation in that context?
Well, the report and the investigation in question did not delve into language use in the academic space. It dealt specifically with language use in the space of residences, which is still a formal space of the university, but it's not an academic space. So I'd rather not comment on that, because that gets deeper into the academics and the language policy of Stellenbosch University, which is a very deep topic and a debate that's been going on for years, and probably still will, but is not actually encapsulated in this report.
Yeah. So similarly then, if we are to take it in that context of residences, you are therefore, as the South African Human Rights Commission, recommending that even other languages, South African languages of the 9 or so that we have, including sign language, should be permitted in those residences, and those students should not be told what language to use when they are in that space.
No, of course, definitely that shouldn't be allowed. You should be allowed to speak the language of your choice and not be told to speak a particular language, at least in the settings that we're talking about here.
Yeah. And how are you going to, for lack of a better word, police the enforcement of your recommendations? Or is that something that you do, or as the Commission, you simply make the recommendations with the hope that the institution is going to comply?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The responsibility of Chapter 9 institutions, it depends. It depends on how you like to view it. The Asia-Pacific region, for example, they believe that national human rights institutions like ours have no interest in enforcing their findings and recommendations. Their job is merely to make them and to bring issues to light, which in itself has value. But the Commission also is of the view that the findings and recommendations and suggested proposed relief or remedial action set out by a Chapter 9 institution is binding constitutionally. But that raises very nuanced questions of what it means to be binding. If you want to get into that, we may need to have a bit of a longer interview. Does binding mean you can be arrested and your liberty deprived and physical force used against you if you don't comply? Or is there something more nuanced than that? Yeah. I think we will see where this report leads, and depending on the responses of Stellenbosch University and other role players involved, we'll decide on what to do. But it's early days yet.
We do know from the public protector's experience that that kind of situation did come about, where the president then at the time said, well, recommendations are recommendations. And it was taken back to court, and the court said, no, recommendations are not recommendations, but they are binding and then therefore have to be implemented. Of course, he then went on later and wrote a 2-line letter that says you are thereby duly reprimanded. And that was really all that the president did at the time. And it's something similar, I suppose, in this case, where Stellenbosch University can just write those 2 notes and say we are sorry, and that's the end of it.
I don't think that would be the end of it. I think that the proposed remedial action in there is quite comprehensive. So the Commission has clearly set out what it believes would be appropriate. And I think it's important enough to note that if the university does not comply with that, then they are seen to have dismissed what the Human Rights Commission thinks is appropriate. What does that mean in a country bound by human rights and founded on human rights? It raises a lot of very interesting questions, but I guess we'll get to that when and if we get to that.
Matthew, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on tonight. Matthew du Plessis is with the Human Rights Commission in the Western Cape, the acting provincial manager there.